The money flow template uses one database called transactions for all the ways money moves into and out of your accounts. This includes expenses, income, debt payments, and transfers between accounts. Since different transaction types use different properties, you will record them through views specifically set up to show the relevant properties. These views are found in the Expenses, Income, and Payments and Transfers sections. Each view also has a default template that sets some initial values for your convenience. Let's start with expenses. To record an expense, you can use the blue New button or add a new page directly to the table, but I would encourage using the table since this is the simplest way to see which fields are associated with an expense. This section has several tabs with different settings that are useful for different situations, so I'll explain each one. The first tab, called This Pay Table, relates to the current pay period and shows a table view of paid and unpaid expenses. Unlike a standard interval like a month, where you can tell the template to only show your expenses that occur this month, Notion doesn't know what pay periods are, much less which one you're currently in, so you need to set this filter manually. You do this by clicking on the filter icon, expanding the rule, and selecting the page that corresponds to the current pay period. Once a pay period is selected as a filter, any expenses you enter into this view will automatically be linked to that pay period. I put this view first because if you do get paid at a regular pay interval, which most people do, it's the best way to keep track of all the expenses that have been paid or will become due before your next paycheck. So let's go through the fields. The paid checkbox is used to indicate that the money for this expense has been taken out of or charged to the specified account. It's used to prevent the balance in the account table from updating while the charge is pending, so you can keep your actual account balance in sync with the account balances in Notion. Name is a description of the expense. Next, the amount and the date of the expense. Category is a relation to the categories table, and even if you don't budget by category, associating an expense with categories is helpful when you review your spending habits. The From Account field is where you link to the account you are using to pay the expense. Recurring is a relation to a database that manages all your repeating transactions, which I will cover in the next video. Month and pay period are links to pages in those corresponding databases. The next view shows only the unpaid expenses for the selected pay period, but in a gallery view grouped by account. You can use this view in conjunction with your accounts to ensure you have sufficient funds available in the corresponding accounts to cover your upcoming expenses before your next scheduled pay. Note that these first two tabs related to pay periods have an asterisk on them to remind you that the pay period has to be set manually. The next two tabs contain similar views to the two we have just seen, but apply to the month. If you don't have a regular pay interval or prefer to manage your finances by month, these are the two views you would use. In that case, since you're not tracking by pay periods, you can delete the pay period views by clicking on the tab to access the View menu, then Delete. You can also hide references to pay periods in any of the tabs using the Property menu and then hide in View. The next two tabs present the same fields for a time period of the next 2 weeks, since this is the most common pay interval. Finally, the last tab contains all your expenses. Something I want to point out is that most of the table views here and for all transactions are sorted by date increasing. So when you look at your expenses for the month, going down the table, your expenses appear chronologically. However, for the last view that contains all your expenses, these will appear with the most recent ones first, working backward. As you start adding more transactions to the database, you're more likely to want to access something more recent, so showing them in the reverse order is probably more efficient. With respect to expenses, the last thing I want to show you is the default template. Every transaction type has a default template, which is programmed to be created depending on the view that you initiate from. So for all these expense views, the default template is the expense template. So let's have a look at it. You can see a default icon is set, the date defaults to today, expense is selected as the type, and 2025 is linked as the year. This is where you could link to a default month and pay period if you didn't want to enter those every time you record an expense. You just have to remember to change them as the pay period and month changes. Now let's move on to the income section. This section has 3 tabs, one for income this month, then income this month by type, and finally one for all income. Similar to expenses, adding a new page directly to the table will help you more easily identify which fields are associated with income. Enter the details for the income you are recording. Most of these fields are self-explanatory, or I have already mentioned them above. Income also links to an account, but here we use the to account property instead of from account, so the money gets added to the account, not subtracted. The template for income is similar to the one for expense, but uses a different default icon. The date still defaults to today, income is selected as the type, and 2025 is linked as the year. Again, this is where you could link to a default month and pay period if you didn't want to enter those every time you record income. You just have to remember to change them as the pay period and month changes. I put payments and transfers in the same section because I don't find I use them as often as expenses and income. Also, both of these types of transactions perform the same action of moving an amount from one account to another account. If the transaction is moving money to a debt account, for example, from a checking account to a credit card or loan, use the Payments tab. If you're moving money from one banking account to another, like from checking to savings or from one checking account to another checking account at a different bank, use the Transfers tab. Payments and transfers also have default templates assigned to them, with the only difference from the ones we've already seen being the icon and transaction type. Since we're here looking at the template, you can see the properties are separated into sections because there may be situations when entering transactions into a table view is not ideal, like when you're on your phone and you use those buttons I showed you earlier. Actually, I'll demonstrate a button so you can see what happens. When you use a button, a new page will be created based on the corresponding template. So this one is using the expense template. The default values are set, and the section titles specify which fields you should enter for each transaction type. These required properties appear first so you don't forget to set them and apply to all transaction types. Next, you'll see the expense, transfer, and payment section. All these use the category and from account fields. If you're entering income, you'll need to specify the income source. You'll also need to enter a destination account, just as you would for transfers and payments, as indicated by this section. The attributes in the dependent properties section are for specific situations. We've already seen the reconcile checkbox, which you can use to reconcile an account. If the transaction is recurring, you will link through that field. In the next video, I'll show you how to set up these recurring transactions.